Hi guys. So this is going to be the lecture on Pet Sematary. Of course, for Essay 2, you will be tasked with identifying one message imparted by either this film or Soul. And here, I just wanted to share what messages I see in this film to hopefully give you some ideas about what to write about. So that said, let's get into this film and try to decipher its rhetoric and what messages it might be sending. First things first, in order to understand this film's rhetoric, we should recognize the rhetorical possibilities of its genre. So this is obviously a horror film, and appealing to its audience's fear might help in sending its message. And of course, appealing to the audience's fear would count as an appeal to pathos. So we now must ask what messages the film might be trying to send by way of scaring us. Well, this film deals with two common, universal human fears: the fear of separation and the fear of extinction. Now, these are just what they sound like. With the fear of separation, this refers to basically the fear of loss, of our interpersonal relationships that we depend upon for happiness being suddenly severed. We definitely see that in the film in the form of Ellie's unexpected death. The film also deals with the fear of extinction, which is basically the fear of death, but more broadly speaking could include the fear of ceasing to exist, something we humans can't really comprehend since existing is all we know. Now, connected to that, I would argue that this film really tackles this fear by having something to say about the afterlife and humans' belief or lack of belief in the afterlife. And that's definitely something I want to talk about with this film, so we'll move forward in order to get to that. Now, because this is a horror film, it naturally has several features common to pretty much all horror films, and that's what we call horror tropes. So I'll quickly go through the first three bullet points first of all. In this film, we have the familiar horror creature of the zombie, although I'd argue that the zombies in this film aren't your typical zombies, and perhaps not even zombies at all, and we'll explore that as we go forward. The next bullet point is the creepy children's drawing, something we see very, very often in horror movies, especially more modern horror movies. Looking at Gage's drawing here, I'm honestly not 100% certain what it's supposed to depict. My best guesses are it's either Victor Pascal with his injured head, or else Ellie getting hit by the truck. Either way, those two characters of Ellie and Victor, I'd say, are very important to the film's messages, and I think the fact that the film goes out of its way to draw attention to either of them with this familiar horror trope of a creepy kid's drawing really shows that the film wants us to pay attention to these characters. So with Ellie, and we'll talk more about her in a bit, she sort of represents that typical scary child, almost always a girl, in horror films, with her creepy dress and creepy long hair. In the book and in the 1989 film version, it actually isn't she who dies, but her brother Gage. And we have a killer toddler in those older versions of the story. So it might be said this film is playing it safer, maybe trying to be a bit more serious by giving us a familiar, expected horror image of a creepy 9 or 10-year-old girl as opposed to a killer 3-year-old, which might be a little bit silly, but at the same time is more original. But I would say using her for the child who is resurrected instead of Gage really helps with the film's messages, which I want to save talking about until the end, because I actually want to first talk about the character of Victor Pascal, who I would argue is critical to what the film is trying to communicate. So Victor, on one level, might represent a common trope in horror films, wherein a black character helps a white character by explaining the magic or the supernatural element of the film to the white character. Victor certainly does that by warning Lewis about the sour burial ground, right? The reason this trope exists is because we might sometimes associate non-white characters with magic because of basically their heritage and the cultures they come from, like voodoo culture or something of that nature. Stephen King is actually guilty of using this trope a lot, For example, Dick Halloran in The Shining is the one who explains the psychic power of The Shining, and Mike Hanlon in It is the one who explains the ritual of Chud to get rid of Pennywise the Clown. And this is criticized quite often as a trope because it's set to sideline black characters and make them to where they can't exist apart from the white characters who need their help in these horror stories. I actually initially thought that Victor fell into this trope upon my first viewing of the movie, but after watching it a few more times, I can now see how his race might actually be relevant to one of the film's messages. And I think his race is relevant because it gives him a connection to the Native Americans who left the cursed burial ground behind. Now, Native Americans are known to feature in horror films as well. Honestly, perhaps they are more a Stephen King movie trope than a horror trope. The Overlook Hotel in The Shining, for example, was built on a Native American burial ground, and the ritual of Chud in It Chapter 2 is of Native American origin. So Native Americans are often associated with magic in horror films as well. But I want to examine this a little more closely in this film and see how Victor Pascal and the Native Americans who left the burial ground behind serve the message of the film, instead of just being, your typical horror characters who fall into the pattern of horror tropes. So Victor Pascal was actually a white character in the novel and in the first film version of the story, so making him black in this version was deliberate on the filmmaker's part. I'd argue that they didn't make this decision simply to have another black horror movie character who explains the magic of the film to the white characters, but instead to add to the film's messages. Now let's consider the rhetorical situation of this film to really help us understand what its messages might be. The rhetorical situation is something that you need to identify in the essay in the intro paragraph, because understanding the rhetorical situation can really shed light on the film's message. Remember, the rhetorical situation always involves context, because communication never takes place in a vacuum. So in this case, the film came out in 2019, at the height of the culture wars, which are still very much continuing today. When I say culture wars, I just mean the general conflict that arises due to changes in America's social landscape that we're seeing rapidly advancing nowadays. The perceived erasure of supposed social hierarchies causing upset, etc., etc. For example, in 2017, the Unite the Right rally included chants of "Jews will not replace us." And some might say this rally was a precursor of sorts to what happened at the Capitol in January, which was basically the result of certain people wanting a certain social vision for America, and fearing this would be threatened by a new administration. What's interesting about the mid to late 2010s, and this is still happening today, is the culture wars have extended into popular culture. We all know the Disney live-action remakes, right? And how they try to be more woke, as it were. In Beauty and the Beast from 2017, for example, they try to make Belle more independent as a woman, and she works with her hands to create inventions just like her father, something a woman in her time might not be expected to do. They also have LeFou reinterpreted as a gay character for some more diverse representation. And it could be said Pet Sematary is doing that same sort of thing by casting a black actor as Victor, simply trying to diversify the cast a little bit. We should also note that Pet Sematary itself is a remake. Notably, it also is set in modern times, not the 80s when the original story was set. So that definitely hints to me that this movie is more attuned to our current situation and our current culture war landscape than the previous versions of the story. So that historical and socio-cultural context in mind, I propose that Victor is made into a black character in this film to connect him to the Native Americans who left behind the cursed burial ground that lies beyond the Pet Sematary, in service to an anti-colonialist message in the film. As Victor's ancestors had their freedom stolen from them for slave labor, the Native Americans had their land stolen from them for the gain of white colonizers. So having Victor, like the Native Americans, warn people against going to the burial ground if you remember the Native American people, and if you remember, the Native Americans built the deadfall that blocks the burial ground and left warnings on the trees. So we have non-white characters warning white characters, and the white characters don't listen. They go to use the burial ground for their own gain, and having Victor as a black character really emphasizes a clash between cultures, not emphasized too much in the previous versions of the story. And that would make sense given the film was made amid intense culture wars in America. Lewis uses the native ground for his own gain, to resurrect his daughter in this case. So he's doing something similar to what colonizers did before him. He's continuing that colonialist legacy, which people on one side of the culture war would say should not be continued. Because if it continues, the film says, there's only going to be more bloodshed. Untold numbers of Native Americans and African slaves died and suffered because of colonial activities. And when Lewis does his colonialist-like action and resurrects Ellie using the native burial ground, she goes on to kill people. So from that, we can definitely see the film calling for an end to the culture wars, calling for an end to a colonialist legacy, because it will only result in more horror. Showing us that horror, appealing to pathos by making us feel scared or horrified or disgusted by it, really helps in sending that anti-colonialist message to us. But I'd say the film also has something to say on religion, specifically clashes among different religions, going along with the message against culture wars we just talked about. So the first thing to say about the topic of religion in the film is the difference between the pet cemetery and the Native American burial ground that is right next to it. The fact that they are jutting against each other really highlights a theme of culture clash. The first thing to note about the pet cemetery is the misspelling in its name. To underscore the significance of that, we might also note that the grave markers in the pet cemetery are virtually all shaped like Christian crosses. From this, we can gather that the pet cemetery is a Christian space, as opposed to the space of the burial ground, which is associated with indigenous beliefs and myths like the Wendigo. The misspelling of the pet cemetery's name reflects childhood innocence. We must remember that children made this cemetery for their pets. We even see that at the beginning of the film when they are having that procession for the deceased dog. So in that sense, the film might be trying to portray Christianity as this innocent, childlike way of dealing with death. You know, having that vague, nice thought of people looking down from heaven, as Rachel puts it. That's her way of coping with her sister's horrible death by spinal meningitis, by believing in this nice, warm afterlife in heaven. Something else I noticed is this American flag adorning one of the graves in the pet cemetery. Now, I couldn't find a similar American flag in the 1989 version, and it's not mentioned in the book either. It could be incidental, but the fact that another American flag that looks identical to the one in the cemetery turns up later on the front of Judd's house indicates to me it probably means something. And what it could mean, given the film's socio-cultural context of ongoing culture wars, is that the pet cemetery might be seen as not only this Christian space, but also this representation or microcosm of post-colonial America. In terms of religion, colonizers, as we know from history, try to replace Native American beliefs with their own Christian beliefs. We see that sort of thing in some form with Judd, who has a cross in his house and, like I said, has that American flag on the front of his house. Judd is definitely a grieving man in this film. He lost his wife, and Ellie brightens up his world so much he wants to bring her cat back to life because he can't stand the thought of death making her sad, like it's made him. Now, Judd seems to brighten at Ellie's suggestion that his deceased wife Norma is looking down from heaven. He seems to really like that idea. But it's not enough for him considering he uses the burial ground anyway, resurrecting his dog in the past and also Ellie's cat to try and dull death's sting. And of course, him using that ground has horrible consequences, just as it does for Lewis, who has no belief in any afterlife. And I think it's interesting also how we have several deer heads in Judd's house, representing, I'd argue, the antlered creature, the Wendigo. The camera even zooms in on that deer head trophy at one point. So basically, the Wendigo is creeping into Judd's life, all because he had a hard time dealing with death and the sorrow it brings. So all that said, now I want to consider names in the film and how they're relevant to what the film has to say about religion. So we have our main family with the last name Creed. Creed means belief, and with Lewis that's ironic considering he has no belief in an afterlife. Something else to consider is the cat's name, Church. It's short for Winston Churchill, yes, but I'd argue just the name Church is relevant to the film's message on religion. Church, of course, is where many people first learn about the afterlife. You go to church, you learn about heaven. And through Church's resurrection, Lewis learns about life after death, right? But he remains an unbeliever in the afterlife, I'd say, because he says to Ellie when she's back from the dead, "You're not dead, you're here." As in, one's physical presence equals not dead. And something I wanted us to consider is if this film even suggests, does this film even suggest that there is an afterlife at all? Because I'd say Church's resurrection doesn't represent a true afterlife. Not really. I think a big question this film asks that previous versions of the story don't hit upon is whether these undead characters, Church, Ellie, and eventually the whole family minus Gage, are actually even the reanimated corpses of the family at all. I know that sounds strange, but something caught my eye in this film. That being the fact that the apparently resurrected Ellie turns into Norma to taunt Judd. I had a difficult time understanding why the film added those animal masks. They aren't in the book or in the older movie, but they might have been added just for the sake of this reveal of Ellie turning into Norma for a minute. That all might just be in Judd's mind. He might be imagining her turning into Norma. But we do sort of see that Ellie creature zombie person shapeshift. And that suggests to me that it's not Ellie at all, as her mother Rachel says. Her mother says, "You're not Ellie. Ellie is dead." And the film also seems to suggest that dead is dead and there is no afterlife. Because the Ellie zombie even responds, "Back from where?" when Lewis says, "You're back." There's also the symbol of butterflies I wanted to note. Now, there are some spots in the film where you see them on Ellie's shirt, but they're probably most prominent when they are shadows around her room in the bedroom scene after she comes back from the grave. Butterflies can be symbols of rebirth, but they can also be a symbol of transformation. Butterflies come from caterpillars who seemingly die in their chrysalis, only to emerge as butterflies. Now, it could be said that the original caterpillar isn't back, but it's more accurate to say that it turned into something else. And I think the film is hinting that's what happened to Ellie, because dead, the film seems to say, really is dead. She isn't really Ellie. But that's hard for us to accept, isn't it? That's a big problem humanity has always faced. In a sense, this film follows the problem-solution textual structure we talked about with long written text, in that it presents this problem of grief and tells us how we should deal with it. We have all these characters haunted by death, basically, and they all have different beliefs on what happens after death, if anything. Rachel is haunted by her sister's death, as clearly indicated in many scenes where she has visions of her. The film even adds the dumbwaiter element, which wasn't in the book or the old movie, to create those scenes, even showing blood leaking out of the dumbwaiter. We also see Lewis, who doesn't believe in heaven like Rachel does, being awash in the red glow of a stoplight, like he's covered in blood. We see that meaningful use of color there, definitely. This happens right after he sees Victor die, so it obviously had an effect on him. So the idea is whatever belief or lack of belief we may have, everyone is affected by death. Everyone is bothered by death, that is. You know, that's just part of our nature. It's one of the fears we all share, like I said at the beginning. So there are several things we humans tend to do in the face of death. We might default to a belief in the afterlife, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Or we might even lie about death. Rachel wanted to lie about Church's death, saying anything but dead, because she just can't stand death. And when Church comes back, those block letters that spell out Ellie's name, some of them are knocked over so it says lie instead. Which really underscores how wrong it is that they try and fight death with lies, right? Judd even shames Lewis for trying to hide the truth from Ellie. And so Rachel, Judd, and Lewis alike all have trouble with death, though their beliefs are all diverse. Lewis is an atheist, Rachel believes in heaven, and Judd at least entertains the idea of heaven, but in the end it seems accepting death and not dwelling on how to reverse it is the right thing to do. Rachel seems to learn this. She seems to go through an arc. She is not happy to see the resurrected Ellie. She's horrified, like she's shaking and nodding her head at the same time because she doesn't know what to think. But she eventually does know it's a bad thing that Ellie is back. Supposedly, at least. Because she goes on to say to that zombie, thing, creature, whatever it is, that you aren't really Ellie because Ellie is dead. So is all this to say the film has a message against Christianity? Is it wrong to believe in heaven and not accept that dead is dead, according to this movie? I wouldn't say so, honestly. I think the film is rather saying that no religion is necessarily right, and that while we can have our beliefs on death, we shouldn't tamper with death. It's perfectly natural, as Lewis says at the beginning of the film, before going off the deep end with his grief. Judd also says the Wendigo might be just a crazy folktale, but something is up there at the burial ground. So what that something is left ambiguous. We don't really know the force behind the burial ground. It doesn't have to be the Wendigo. For all we know, it could be Satan. We could definitely see that with the Wendigo's antlers, because horns are often associated with Satan as well. So it could be Satan or whatever that is the evil force behind the burial ground. So no religion is necessarily right, the film seems to say. No religion is necessarily wrong either. No religion is necessarily good or bad. There's nothing wrong with belief or lack of belief on the subject of death and what happens after it, if anything. But when you get so bothered by death, belief or lack in belief eventually becomes not enough for you. And then when it's not enough for you, that's when you get into dangerous territory, which the film warns against. So ultimately, circling back to the anti-colonialist message we might see in this film, I'd say it's ultimately trying to tell us that we should all believe what we want about death and coexist peacefully in our diverse beliefs, instead of one group trying to assert that their beliefs are right. And that definitely fits with the socio-cultural context of culture wars, since the conflict of such culture wars stems over whose beliefs are quote-unquote right and whose are quote-unquote wrong. So ultimately, we all should accept death in our own way, be we atheists, Christians, believers in indigenous religions, or what have you. And finally, I wanted to note the fact that the movie switches the child who dies from Gage in the original book and old movie to Ellie in this film. I honestly really like the change and don't think it's just to give us a traditional horror image of a scary little girl. I think the film's message on accepting death, and not fretting over the afterlife, even if you choose to believe in it, really is helped by the conversations that Ellie has with Rachel. Of course, a toddler like Gage can't talk, but Ellie says there is something after death, and she's seen it, and it's worse than you can imagine. But Rachel shoots down that idea, because Rachel comes to accept death. So indeed, sometimes dead is better, as the famous line from All version of the story goes. Alright guys, so that's what I had on Pet Sematary. Hopefully from all of that, you have a better idea of what the movie is getting at and what its messages might be. Feel free to use this as a guide while writing the paper if you are writing about this movie, but don't straight up copy it, obviously, and I encourage you to really try and find more meaning in the symbols and images that I've mentioned here, and see if there's other things about the movie and its images and its audio, etc., that help in sending its message that I didn't mention. Alright, guys, thank you again, and I'll see you in the soul lecture next. Alright, guys, thank you and goodbye.